Hi everyone. You've already spotted what I have on the table. It's one of my old favourites, the EM-2, or two different flavours of EM-2. There isn't really any one type of EM-2, I suppose is the first thing to say. A fair chunk of my book is devoted to this type. You don't have to go and check that out, but there's an awful lot of information there if you do. Without wishing to be delivering too much of a shameless plug for my own book, said book, there are 90 copies available direct from Headstamp, I have been informed, only recently. So if you're interested in picking up a copy, go and check out the Headstamp publishing website. If you're in the UK and concerned about shipping, the Royal Armouries shop does, I believe, still have some copies as well. If nothing else, it will stop your door from blowing open in the wind because it's immense. One of the annexes to that, which was later expanded into an article in the journal that I helped to run called Armax, was on the issue of 2 EM-2 rifles to 4 battalions that were operational in what was then British Malaya. This is part of the ongoing Malayan emergency, as the Brits called it. That was ongoing at the time in that part of the world, and so British regiments were deployed there already. There was also over in Singapore, where a lot of British facilities were actually located at the time for that part of the world, was the Operational Research Section, and so this section received these 2 EM-2 rifles. They were then passed on to, or shared around between 4 battalions. So this was in 1952, and the rifles were operationally trialled for around 2 years, 52 to 53. So I need to dial it back a little bit for those of you who aren't very familiar with the EM-2 as a more standard rifle, because this actually was adopted in April 1951 as the next standard rifle of the British Armed Forces. Only 8 months later, it was kind of unadopted, although it took a lot longer than that to have it formally removed from the books, as it were. So it was technically adopted for a bit longer than that, but after 8 months, it was dead in the water. It wasn't going anywhere. Some of you probably know this story, but it's a fascinating bit of 1950s Cold War politics involving Britain still trying to be a driving force in the world and in the arena of military technology, and America as the sort of senior partner in what was going to become NATO, and this is where these nations were all going, and Belgium, Canada, various other players as well, but Britain and America having a bit of an argument about what would be the next type of standard cartridge and the rifle to fire it. And long story short, Britain thought it had nailed it with the EM-2 as essentially their version of the German assault rifle concept, with a reduced power cartridge, automatic fire, nice and compact, under 8 pounds, whereas America was not having it and wanted a full power cartridge and didn't care so much about the weight. And so, long story short, both of those ended up getting killed off. But before they were fully killed off, there was a prospect of going to one of a number of compromise cartridges, and the ultimate compromise was to just adopt the American preferred cartridge, the 7.62 by 51, what would become the NATO standard round. So even then, the EM-2 is still alive. The rifle still has a prospect of being adopted in 7.62, and we have the X2E1 experimental version of the EM-2. We have lots of those here, where there's still a chance in 1953 that we might be able to adopt EM-2. The other countries probably aren't going to, maybe Canada, but we might still stick with it, or at least as the sort of frontline rifle, and then we maybe adopt some other stuff too, because this thing was going to be expensive. So that's all backstory to inform these 2 rifles, which are the very 2 rifles that went out to British Malaya to be tried out on the ground, as it were, by actual operational units. Now, some of that was done on sort of ranges, or what they call now field firing areas in country, so not actually going out and encountering the enemy. But we do also know that they were taken out on active patrol in the jungle, where they could have encountered the enemy, being members of the communist-led insurgency to try to kick the Brits out. this is all sounding very exciting. I do have to bring you down a little bit by saying we don't have any evidence of actual contact happening while one member of a patrol was armed with an EM-2. But the results of the trials are nonetheless very interesting, and I'll give you some of those in a minute. But let's look at the rifles themselves. It's really, really nice to have identified, verified examples that have history. We're always getting excited about that on this channel with good reason. Generic examples are great for a number of reasons, but the ones that have actual known history are the museum sweet spot, really. So, we'll start with this one. So the two rifles that went out were serial numbers 10 and 11. This is 11. So let me first of all just confirm that for you. A little hard to see, but on the trigger mechanism housing or lower receiver is a very simply marked 11. And that's actually the only mark you get on these EM-2s. Very little in the way of marking on these things. Bear in mind they are experimental rifles. The rifle that was adopted in 1951 as rifle number 9, replacing rifle number 4, none of those were ever made. There were no EM-2s made to that build standard. So this is a real mishmash, and it was altered later on as well. So just as it comes to me, this feature here is interesting. This sort of plate that is shrouding the magazine catch. You can see next to it there, for obvious reasons, I think. Thinking of the Malayan jungle, any knock on that magazine catch is going to result in your magazine falling out and you only get one shot. A problem that would re-emerge with the SA-80 decades later. And so that was solved as early as 1951 with this pinned on and welded on steel plate. And that is on the design drawings for rifle number 9. So had the EM-2 gone into mass production or production at all, this feature would have been standard. So it's not only experimental. Relatively minor thing, but it's one of the features that is actually quite rare on surviving EM-2s. This is otherwise, well, it's possibly in exactly the configuration that it went to Malaya in, but that I think is unlikely. There's no mention in the records of a short barrel, because that's the other distinctive feature of this example. This is a barrel that's lost a good 5 inches off the end there. A loose type that was first introduced in 1950, so the first year that the EM-2 was standardized in any way. The designs were around in 1949, but the EM-2 as a thing really only appeared in 1950, and we already had this short paratrooper variant was the primary intent of that, we believe. But this is not one of those. This was done later. The 1950 version, the short bulldog, which is what it was called, had, bizarrely enough, they cut the barrels down, drilled out the middle of the bit on the end that has the bayonet lugs, and then sleeved that back over the barrel. So the other rifle you might see floating around pictures of has the bayonet lugs, so you can fit the standard bayonet. Whenever this was converted, they didn't care about bayonets for some reason. Presumably it was just done for some experimental purpose that I was unable to find in the archive. And it's just a plain diameter barrel. So it's just possible that this went to Malaya as a short-barreled rifle, bearing in mind that the intended role there was that of machine carbine, i.e. doing the same thing you'd do with a Sten gun or an Owen gun, and that was also done with a Bren gun quite a lot, surprisingly. And a shorter barrel would make sense in the jungle, but balance of probability is it went out with a full 24-inch barrel and was cut down when it came back. But there's an even more interesting bit of history around this one, which is that it blew up. So this incident was a combination of user error, as we would say today, and a design flaw in which the extractor, the claw that pulls the case out when you fired it, didn't always snap over the base of the case. So it was possible to punt around into the breech without having the extractor hooked over it, which means when you then pull the bolt back, your live round doesn't come out. That left a live round in the chamber. That was then not noticed by the range officer at the time, or the firing point officer as we call them then, with the result that when the bolt went forward again, carrying a new cartridge toward the chamber, the pointed bullet initiated the primer of the round that was in the breech without the bolt being closed. Now, there's a lot of speculation about bullpups as a broad type of firearm being dangerous because the action is directly under your face, your eyes. You know, this is all very important stuff here. So people, especially in the States, will criticize bullpups and say, well, you don't want a gun with the action at the back, which is what a bullpup is, of course, because if it were to suffer a breech explosion, like it did in 1953 to a member of the Gordon Highlanders, you're going to get everything coming up and potentially kill you or damage you. Well, there's nothing in the report to suggest that there was any injury at all. Now, that's not to say there wasn't a cut on the head or something. I think in 1953, they wouldn't have regarded that as an injury. But there was certainly, the soldier was not seriously hurt. Now, that's one data point, but I think it's worth mentioning. You notice that this is locked open. The magazine catch on the EM-2 is also the bolt release. Or you insert a loaded magazine, and it will go forward of its own accord and chamber that round. It's an automatic loading system, very rare on any firearm really. But that's a standard feature, nothing to do with this specific topic. In case you're wondering what the damage was to this thing before it was repaired, so it blew the magazine spring and base plate out of the bottom of the magazine. So the magazine body stayed attached to the rifle, but the guts of the magazine, as it were, blew out. It bent the cartridge that was on the top of the magazine, and of course it destroyed the round that was coming forward. Well, probably both rounds actually, the one in the chamber and the one that was used as a firing pin essentially. They also mentioned that the metal cover around the breech was loosened, which is rather a euphemistic term, I suspect. This is a piece of spring steel, the breech cover. They vary in shape depending on the variant of the EM-2. Typically, it's a cylindrical bit and a conical bit like this one, and it's just a loose bit of sheet metal. Well, I dare say it wouldn't be loose in a brand new gun, but nonetheless, and it just covers that hot bit of the chamber area of the barrel, the breech area, which otherwise would be a bit close to your hand. You don't want to touch that. You also don't want an extra sort of trap for dirt and mud and all that kind of thing. So it's literally just a cover under which is the very end, the breech end of the barrel, and that was loosened. I suspect that means it was splayed partly open. We haven't got photos, unfortunately. And the final bit of damage was that the extractor itself on the face of the bolt, or around the face of the bolt, was broken as well. That's not uncommon in a breech explosion. But the bolt itself was seemingly undamaged. The receiver was seemingly undamaged. The barrel was. There's not even any mention of the furniture being damaged. So it took that out of battery explosion really quite well. But it was out of action and needed to be sent back to the ORS at Singapore, who would sent it back to the UK for repair. And I believe that was the end of its operational trials life. But there's one more feature we haven't covered on this. Now, I have recreated this when I first encountered this rifle, or carbine if you prefer. It's a bullpupped bullpup, a bullpup squared if you like. When I first encountered it, it had this sight cover fitted the normal way around. And I'm going to quickly show you what I mean by that. We're coming to this one, don't worry. So it's meant to be this way around, with the small aperture at the rear. It's just a sheet metal cover to protect the optic underneath, and the large aperture at the front. But what they found in Malaya, in the jungle at least, was that this was much easier to pick up for snap shooting. So you see a target moving across, you quickly bring it up. They found it easier to pick up this big round black hole effectively with the ocular lens of the optic in the middle of it. So it's almost like centering a front sight post within a rear sight aperture, if that makes sense. And they're not really doing that, but they found it easier to pick up the bit in the middle using this as a sort of a frame. Might be quite subjective, but that was one of the results of the trial. So I have temporarily mounted this backwards just to explain that for you. You can see it does slide perhaps a little too freely. Now that's a modification that was not taken forward. You can actually see the back end of the optic itself there with it slid back like that. You would want it sitting about there. Not ideal. It doesn't really sit properly in place if it's the wrong way around, which is why I'm going to reverse it after this. So the sights did come in for some criticism, but there was this workaround established for turning around the shield. But that wasn't the only problem with the sights. This little miniature telescopic sight, only 1 power magnification though, so it's not magnifying. Like many early optical sights, it suffered from condensation, especially in the humid conditions, like tropical conditions basically. So they were fogging up inside the tube, and that was, I believe, addressed. So they were able to seal them up better. That has an interesting reflection with the modern day, actually, because if you look at pictures, MOD pictures of British soldiers out in the jungle with SA-80s, no matter how modern the rifle is, it could be an A3, they take off the LDS, the LCAN sights. So still the British Army prefers iron sights for jungle use, which is fascinating given how much more advanced the LCAN Spectre is compared to the little old unit sight. So would the EM-2 have ended up with some form of iron sights? Well, it already had them by 1952. It had these flip up front post on the front, on the gas block there. And on the side of the carrying handle / optic mount, a little rear aperture as well. So you had emergency backup sights that they could have used in the jungle. I believe they also struggled with these though in the trials. They're also very close together. You want your iron sights to be as far apart as possible. In fact, that is why the EM-1 and EM-2 acquired optical sights, because with a bullpup, with a shortened gun, your two iron sights were too close together for accurate aiming. The amount of movement of the front sight is magnified effectively by them being very close together. It's partly why why long barrel pistols are more accurate, because you have a longer sight radius. So they did have that as an option. A bit of a weird one, and we haven't got a sling on either of these, but the soldiers did report that the service sling that was issued with this thing was too short for carrying purposes. Those of you who have served probably have a better idea of the implications of that than I do. And the final sort of bit of feedback here pertained to magazines. So these magazines, and it would have been, oddly enough, the 6.25mm gun has an older pattern magazine fitted to it that was designated for taking those rounds. But the standard EM-2 magazine at the time would have been this one with this short housing here. Now, there's nothing particularly bad about the design of the EM-2 magazine, I don't think, but rough handling, quote, did result in quite a few dented magazines. Bearing in mind these guys are coming from Lee Enfield number 4s, number 5s, with very short, quite robust magazines that don't come off the weapon. I think there's just a bit of a training issue there. I don't think that these are objectively a poor design, but others may disagree. And the final one, which fascinates me, is that the soldiers were actually asked, would you prefer 30-round magazines, bearing in mind that they're using things like Sten guns, which have 32-round magazines? And the answer was no. They didn't want 30-round magazines. They wanted to stick with the 20-rounders. I suspect that was to do with the profile of the weapon in the prone position. This is a bit of an obsession at the time, especially, that you don't want the magazine sitting too much further down than the base of the pistol grip. They don't specify in the report why they didn't like the idea of a 30-round mag, but I'm pretty sure that's what it would have been. This is a relatively straight magazine. It's not like the AK that curves and makes itself effectively shorter. This would have stuck out fairly dramatically off the bottom of the gun. Could also have snagged on foliage and been a general pain to carry around. But despite those few irks, the rifle was deemed to be very suitable for conditions in the jungle, for use as a machine carbine. I think the implication is that it was generally a serviceable weapon as well. The quote was, "In general, the weapon proved popular with the majority of people who handled it. Comments have been largely conspicuous by their absence. This is regarded as a favourable sign. Another wonderful bit of British turn of phrase there. So number 11, I do believe, sent back to the UK to be repaired. Either at that point or later on, it has its barrel cut down. I don't think it's been retrofitted with a shorter barrel. I think it's just had its own barrel cut down. So this could well be substantially in the configuration it went out to Malaya in. This rifle has been substantially more altered, despite not having blown up, which is interesting. So this is serial number 10. And we have another serial number there, just so you know I'm not lying. In a slightly different location, interestingly. These are pretty ad hoc numbering systems on these experimental weapons. Now, right away, so this is in many ways the focus of this video, or at least it is if you're following over on social media, because it's more unusual. Now, some people are aware of the short EM-2. I don't think many are aware of this thing. So, helpfully, we do like it when there are clues written on things. This has a very, well, as it turns out, late 60s Dymo label on it, telling you that this is in 6.25 millimeters. What on earth is 6.25? Well, we have some examples here. So this is one of the many incarnations of the original 280/7mm British round that caused all that controversy with the rifle number 9, or what was supposed to be rifle number 9. Just an example of that. Now, try to ignore the other two. This is just standard UK version of the 7.62 round. The one in the middle is quite intriguing. That's US 6mm. But try to ignore it and instead compare the EM-2 round with the British 6.25mm round. So this is coming into some NATO trials, hence the involvement of the US, to push ammunition technology to the next level. Now, having said that, we already have, by 1969, the very capable 5.56 by 45mm round, made very famous by the M16, the AR-15. So this is trying to push the envelope and make that small caliber, high velocity class of ammunition even better. So the idea here was to use the same case as 7mm Mark 1Z as it was introduced in 1951, but to what we call neck it down, so literally reduce the size of the neck of the case, because this is a 7mm diameter bullet in this, to fit a significantly smaller 6.25mm diameter bullet that will travel faster, be flatter shooting, more accurate, and potentially defeat body armour. It's a little early for that as a battlefield requirement. And you can see that results in quite a distinctive looking round, quite a fat cartridge case with quite a skinny bullet. And this was the test bed rifle for that round. Now that makes this one of only 2 specific connections between the EM-2 and the SA-80. There's a general connection that they're bullpups, and that there was some institutional bemoaning of the fact that the EM-2 had been killed off by America, and that they were sort of recreating that with the SA-80. But there's no real technical link between the two. It's superficial similarity, except that this 6.25 round was the starting point in 1969 for what became the 4.85mm round in the prototype SA-80. That rifle was designed around that round, and again had to be switched out to 5.56 because of essentially American pressure. So now in both cases, I would tentatively suggest, both cases being not adopting EM-2 and adopting 5.56 instead of the British 4.85, I'd suggest they were probably both the right choice at the time for different reasons. The one thing that arguably did get away, as it were, the one that got away that most of us can sort of agree was perhaps a more profitable way to go than 7.62 is this original 7mm by 43 intermediate round. Now, people will argue that one, and we all ended up with 5.56 as a rifle round anyway, so it's a little academic. But now the barrel they've installed on this to fire the 625 round out of is quite long and quite heavy, and you can see the from the hole in the end that it is a smaller diameter, as if that needed to be proven. Now there is a missing link here with this particular rifle. So this was out in Malaya, being tried out in the field, came back, and then in 1969, so substantially later on, got converted to this configuration. But in the middle, at one point, it was in a similar configuration in the original 7mm cartridge, the 280 round. So it was a sort of H-bar, heavy barrel variant of the EM-2. Presumably looked similar to this. I don't know if the handguard was cut down as it is on this one. I don't know if that was done in 69 or if it was already done for it being this sort of a heavy automatic rifle experimental weapon. So it was experimental as an EM-2, it was experimental in 280 as a heavy barreled EM-2, and it was experimental for the final time in 69 as a 6.25 test bed. And as I say, the round didn't go anywhere, but all that ballistic data directly informed the development of the 485 round, which is tied closely to the SA-80, even if that too was abandoned. As always, guys, thank you very much for watching this video. You can catch us every week doing this. You can also head over to the GameSpot channel if you're into your video games, where the guns and the games merge together. You can also check out our various social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and the website as well. Now, the website's probably the best place to pick up on events and things that are going on at our physical sites. You don't have to come for an event. You can just come and have a good look around up here in Leeds, down at the Tower of London, or our museum down on the south coast of Artillery at Fort Nelson. Please do come and visit us. It's our favourite thing as a museum when people come and physically visit us, as much as we enjoy doing the digital stuff as well.